A fog, thick and oily, like a living creature, crept through the cobblestone streets of London, obscuring the outlines of gas lamps and muffling the clatter of hooves. In this gray haze, permeated with the smell of coal smoke and dampness, a shadow moved. The man walked with his head down, his eyes scanning every inch of the pavement with the tension of a gold prospector peering into the sand of a mountain river. But this man was not looking for gold, nor silver, nor even lost coins. In his hand was an old basket, darkened by time and its contents, and on his right hand, a thick black leather glove. He stopped. His gaze caught on a whitish spot near the wall of a brick house. With professional dexterity, honed over years, he bent down, picked up the find, and placed it in his basket. For a casual passerby, it would have been just rubbish, the repulsive trace of a stray dog's activity. For this man, known on the streets as a, quote, zero, it was bread. It was a place to sleep. It was life. In the mid-19th century, in the very heart of an empire on which the sun never set, excrement became currency, and the streets turned into mines where a resource vital for creating items of the highest luxury was extracted. The paradox of this situation was so immense that contemporaries barely noticed it. A lady stepping out of a carriage in pristine kid gloves to attend the opera would hardly have wondered what the leather embracing her slender fingers had gone through. She saw only whiteness, softness, and elegance. But between the coarse animal hide and this elegant accessory stood a dark, foul-smelling yet absolutely essential industry that connected aristocratic salons with the darkest slums. Leather production was the heart of the industrial economy, and its bloodstream was made up of people with baskets, rummaging through alleys in search of what was politely called, quote, one, though in essence it was the dirtiest substance imaginable. To understand how this became possible, one must delve into the chemistry of the past, into the era before the invention of synthetic reagents. Leather, in its natural state after being removed from an animal, is stiff, prone to decay, and completely unsuitable for tailoring delicate items. To transform raw hide into a soft, pliable material required a complex tanning process, and one of the most critical stages was softening. Tanners needed an alkaline agent containing specific enzymes capable of breaking down certain proteins in the skin's structure without damaging its foundation. In those days, science could not yet offer a powder from a laboratory. Nature, however, offered its solution. Dog feces, especially white, sun-dried varieties, possessed precisely the chemical composition that the craftsman needed. It contained lime and enzymes that acted on the skin like magic, making it incredibly soft and supple. This process was called baiting, and without it, it would have been impossible to create those very bindings for expensive books, saddles for the royal cavalry, and gloves for the upper class. Demand created supply. In London, a city with a population exceeding 2 million, the Bermondsey tanneries worked day and night. They needed tons of raw materials, and while learned men in universities debated high matters, a whole army of people formed on the streets, ready to satisfy this specific demand. They were called pure finders, seekers of purity. The name itself was a bitter irony of street slang. They sought purity, a substance used to clean leather, which itself was the embodiment of impurities. This linguistic game masked reality, allowing society not to call a spade, maintaining the appearance of decency even when discussing the most base matters. This trade was not a chaotic collection of alms. It was a strictly organized structure, invisible to outsiders, but ironclad for those within. The city was divided. streets had their masters. An experienced collector knew every alley in his district, knew the habits of local dogs and the schedule of street sweepers. Competition was fierce. If you delayed, if you went out on your route too late, your prey was taken by another, or, what was even worse, it was swept away by street cleaners, for whom it was just dirt to be destroyed. For the collector, the destruction of goods was equivalent to burning banknotes. Every morning began with a race. One had to outpace the dawn, outpace the street sweeper's broom, outpace a competing colleague. In this world, there was its own economy and its own prices. A bucket of quality white dry excrement, which was valued most for its astringent properties, could cost from 8 to 10 pence. In a week, a diligent collector could earn up to 30 shillings. For comparison, many factory workers earned less. This created a surprising situation. A person engaged in seemingly the most humiliating labor could feel a certain financial independence. He was not a beggar asking for alms. He was a merchant. He sold a commodity that was needed by industry. This realization gave them a strange sense of pride. They did not bow to passers-by, they did their work, considering themselves an integral part of the empire's great economic machine. But this relative independence came at a high price. Social stigma was a heavy burden. The smell, ingrained in their clothes, skin, and hair, was a calling card that cheap soap couldn't wash away. People recoiled from them in the streets. Carriages drove around them. They were untouchables in the heart of civilization. However, within the community of collectors itself, there were gradations and dramas. There were those who worked for themselves, having direct agreements with specific tanneries. These were the elite. They had stable sales and could count on regular income. There were also those who sold what they collected to resellers, losing a portion of the profit but sparing themselves the need to go to the factory and haggle with the masters. The psychology of these people was a complex labyrinth. How does one reconcile themselves to a life dedicated to finding feces? The answer lies in the human capacity for adaptation and finding meaning. They saw not dirt, but a result. They knew that without their bucket of goods, the master could not finish a batch of leather. They felt their power over the process. One day, one of the collectors whose name history has not preserved told a researcher of urban poverty that tanners could turn up their noses all they wanted, but when their order deadlines were burning, they would greet the collector with open arms and pay any price. In this lay their small revenge on a society that despised them. You can hate us, but you cannot do without us. The procedure for handing over the goods was a ritual. The collector would come to the backyard of the tannery. There stood a huge vat or special pits. The master, often sullen and abrupt, would assess the quality. He looked at the color, the consistency. There was nothing disgusting in this for the participants in the transaction, only business. If the product was too wet or contained impurities of sand and dirt, the price dropped. Collectors resorted to tricks. As in any trade, there was deception here. Some mixed lime solution or plaster into the buckets to increase volume and give the desired white color. Experienced masters knew these tricks. They could make the collector overturn the bucket or poke the mass with a stick. It was a constant game of cat and mouse, where each side tried to win a few pennies. In this context, a philosophical, ideological layer of this story unfolds. The Victorian era was a time of obsession with order, classification, and morality. Filth was considered not merely a physical phenomenon, but a moral vice. Cleanliness is next to godliness, preachers would say. And yet, this entire magnificent structure of Victorian morality and aesthetics was based on the processing of impurities. It was a global cycle of matter that society refused to acknowledge. The city was a gigantic organism that consumed and excreted, and the pure finders were the bacteria that closed the cycle, transforming waste back into a resource. They were a living reminder that civilization cannot entirely detach itself from its biological nature, no matter how high it builds the spires of its cathedrals. It is also interesting to trace the relationship between the pure finders and their unwilling suppliers, dogs. In those days, London had a huge number of stray dogs. The pure finders often fed them, creating peculiar symbiotic relationships. The dog received a bone or a crust of bread, and the person gained hope that the animal would remain in their area. Some even tried to keep packs of dogs, turning their shacks into raw material production farms. But this was economically unfeasible. The cost of food for the animals exceeded the profit from selling their products. Economics dictated its harsh laws. Wild, raw material was profitable because it was free. Any attempt to industrialize the process at the raw material production level failed. The system only worked as long as the resource lay underfoot and cost nothing but the effort to pick it up. Decades passed. It seemed this order of things was eternal. Bermondsey tanneries expanded, British leather exports grew, and the army of collectors was replenished with new recruits from among ruined peasants who came to the cities seeking a better lot. But clouds were already gathering on the horizon, which none of them could discern. These clouds were forming not in the sky above London, but in test tubes and retorts of chemical laboratories in Germany and France. Science, which had long ignored the prosaic needs of artisans, finally turned its gaze upon them. The Industrial Revolution was entering a new phase, the phase of synthesis. The transformation crept in unnoticed. First, rumors appeared. Collectors, sitting in cheap pubs after a day's labor, whispered about some factories starting to try some powders. They laughed at it. How could some powder replace natural, time-tested, quote, zero? The masters were also conservative. Old tanners believed in traditional methods. They said that chemicals made leather brittle, that it lost its noble sheen. This gave the collectors a reprieve. But progress was relentless. Chemists worked on formulas, improving the composition of artificial mordants. They learned to isolate the necessary enzymes, learned to control acidity and alkalinity with a precision unavailable when using natural manure. The key turning point occurred when the owners of large manufactories calculated the numbers. Natural raw materials were unstable. Their quality depended on the weather, on the dog's diet, on the honesty of the collector. Today's batch is excellent, tomorrow's is spoiled by rain. This led to spoilage of expensive hides. The chemical reagent was standardized. It always acted the same way. It did not depend on the whims of nature or people. And, most importantly, with mass production, it became cheaper. The moment of truth did not arrive in a single day. But for many, it felt like a sudden blow. Imagine a morning, as foggy as thousands of mornings before it. A collector arrives at the familiar factory gates. His bucket is full of select white goods. He anticipates payment, already mentally allocating the coins. So much for food, so much for a corner in the doss house. But the gates are closed. Or the clerk comes out and dryly says, "No longer needed. We've switched to chemicals." At that moment, the world collapses. This is not just a refusal to buy, it is an announcement that your profession, your skill, your place in the city's food chain are annulled. The price of dog excrement began to fall rapidly. If a bucket once fetched 10 pence, now it was 4, then 2. Collectors scurried through the city, searching for the small workshops that still clung to old methods. But their numbers dwindled. Competition within the trade intensified to an extreme. Now, fights for every piece of street became fiercer because the resource itself had depreciated, and to survive, one needed to collect 3 or 4 times more. This was the agony of a profession. People who prided themselves on not being beggars suddenly found that their labor no longer held value. They faced a terrible choice: either go to the workhouse, which they had avoided their entire lives, or seek other means of survival on streets that grew increasingly hostile. In this final collision of old and new, the full cruelty of progress was revealed. Industrialization did not care for the fates of the people whose professions it destroyed. Thousands of collectors dissolved into the faceless mass of urban poverty. Some began collecting rags, some bones, some simply disappeared, unable to withstand hunger and cold. But it was precisely at this moment of transition that a great irony also manifested. The shift to chemicals made leather production more hygienic, freed areas around factories from a horrifying stench, and reduced the risk of epidemics. The city became cleaner. But this cleanliness was bought at the cost of destroying an entire social stratum. The cleanliness collectors vanished because true cleanliness, chemical, sterile, replaced their paradoxical craft. Looking back at this strange chapter in human history, we see not just a curious fact from the life of Victorian London. We see a mirror reflecting universal laws of economics and society. The history of dog excrement collectors resonates with modernity much more strongly than it might seem at first glance. Don't we see today how technologies make entire professions obsolete in a matter of years? Don't we observe people clinging to fading ways of earning a living, trying to preserve their dignity in the face of algorithms and automation? These people were precursors of the modern gig economy, independent contractors without social guarantees, living day to day, entirely dependent on the demand for their services. Their baskets and gloves are a metaphor for any tool of labor that one day becomes unnecessary. The lesson this story teaches us is to understand the fragility of human utility in the eyes of the market. What seems like dirty gold today, a reliable source of income, can turn to dust tomorrow. But there is another, deeper lesson. This is a lesson about invisible labor. We, like that Victorian lady with the gloves, often prefer not to know where the things we consume come from. We enjoy comfort, cleanliness, and technology without thinking about whose hands and under what conditions they were created. The cleanliness collectors remind us that behind every luxury item, behind every convenience, there is a complex chain of labor, often unpleasant, often underpaid, but absolutely essential for the functioning of society. When we look at old engravings of London, we see magnificent bridges and palaces. But now, knowing this story, we can discern in the shadows of these palaces a stooped figure with a basket. He walks through the fog, his gaze fixed on the ground. He is looking for what others turn away from. He is part of the foundation on which the empire stood. And although his craft has passed into history, dissolving in the acid baths of chemical factories, his ghost continues to wander through the pages of history, reminding us that the line between dirt and gold is not in the chemical composition of a substance, but in human need and the ability to give things value. The circle has closed. We started with a white glove and end with it. It lies in a museum display case, immaculate, preserving the shape of a hand that is long since gone. Visitors admire the skill of the tanner, but if you listen closely, through the glass of the display case, you can hear a distant, barely discernible sound, the shuffling of soles on wet cobblestones, and the dull thud of something soft falling into a wicker basket. This is an echo of a bygone era, the voice of dirty gold, without which this impeccable beauty would never have come into being. History abhors a vacuum, and nothing in it disappears without a trace. Every particle of the past, even the most unsightly, is woven into the fabric of the present. And perhaps, right now, in some other corner of the world or in another sphere, new cleanliness collectors are doing their invisible work so that the world continues to spin, shine, and pretend that dirt does not exist.